Welcome to Skurnik's office for this seminar, which is called What It's Not. And this is obviously going to be a blind tasting of spirits to talk about really what it's not, the art of deducing what things are and aren't, right? This is Gabe Clary, dear friend, coworker. Gabe manages the Terry Theise Portfolio here at Skurnik Wines, which is all of our champagne, German, and Austrian wine. One of the more knowledgeable people on the subject of wine and food that I know. An excellent taster. And we wanted to kind of open up by just tasting some wine and talking to Gabe a little bit about what goes into tasting. Has anyone seen the movie Somm before? Right? So there's the entire standardized process. And I feel like, well, that's a little bit much and doesn't necessarily apply entirely to what we do in spirits and tasting spirits. There is a lot of overlap. And I feel like far too often we don't dive deep into these details. So we're going to talk to Gabe. We're going to drink this wine. It is not a blind wine. We're going to talk about what it is, why it is, and all the things.
Okay.
Yeah?
Cool.
This is Amanda. Does everyone know Amanda?
Yeah, everyone knows. Hey guys.
She's in charge.
So for those of you who have seen the movie Somm, you've seen a sommelier, people who are studying for the master sommelier examination run through tasting. So you're basically running through this deductive tasting format that you see in front of you. Everybody have this. This is directly from the Court of Master Sommeliers, which is an organization. Basically, there's a hierarchy of tests, and a master sommelier is somebody who has mastered kind of a number of different areas in wine. And so this is something that after you do it enough, you start to really do it kind of from memory. You don't have to look at this chart. Those guys in the movie have been tasting for a very long time, and they're kind of running through this grid, they call it a grid, to deduce what the wine in front of them is. And this is something that I think for wine professionals is really interesting. We do a lot of blind tasting here at our office. Almost every day somebody puts what we call a blinder up on our lab, and we walk up there with a glass, pour ourselves a taste, and taste and really think about the wine. One thing that I think is really important about blind tasting is that it removes all of the other aspects. The context is just the wine itself. You have no idea who the producer is, where it comes from, so you don't build a construct based on that. It's just really what the wine is and what it isn't, and that's kind of where the deduction comes from. When you do this, it's also kind of expanding your mind and kind of pushing you to think about what is in your mouth and what you're smelling in a different way, and trying to kind of get a little more granular. So the wine that we have in front of us is a white wine, obviously. We'll take a sniff and see what you think. It's the first thing. You take a look at the color, you run through this kind of grid. What color is it? Is it clear? Is it hazy? Some of those things would be flaws. If it's white, what kind of white? That's going to give you an idea of what the grape variety is.
Clarity itself, I mean, when you look in the center of the bowl, right, as you tilt it towards you, you have what's called the lip, which you can see closest to you, and it's usually a little darker in color. And then you look at the center of the glass, and that's the bowl, and depending on whether that's clear, opaque, kind of you can start to determine age or lack thereof.
Yeah, the rim here, as you tilt the glass, you put it over this white table. This will give you an idea for, it's very clear at the edge and a little bit kind of darker in color. There's also a green tinge to the wine a little bit. It's not a golden, rich colored wine. So, when we're thinking about this leads me to believe it's a grape variety that's on the lighter side. This is Riesling. When you smell it, I think that aspect kind of jumps out. Riesling is a pretty...
Yeah, I had a question. Why is it that you, out of all the grapes that you chose, I mean, I know you work with Riesling, sure. What is it about Riesling for you?
Riesling is really multifaceted. It's not just one thing, and I think that's a really interesting wine to start with. It's something to really think about, because it's not always super overt. It doesn't smell just like peaches or pit fruits. or lychee. It has like this whole spectrum of aromas that this grape variety is capable of. So when you smell this wine, it doesn't smell like one particular thing. It smells like a multitude of different things. There are fruit aromas, and then there's a whole range of aromas that we find in this wine specifically that are non-fruit aromas. There's almost, people talk about minerality in flavor. I think that there's some of that in aroma as well, kind of this chalky aroma, stony aroma. There's also, Riesling, especially as it ages, develops aromas of like black tea, this kind of non-fruit aroma side really kind of comes out in Riesling as it gets older, but it's also available as a young wine as well.
Yeah, I mean, people talk about Riesling as being one of the more transparent types of varieties. They can age, really, really long. Some of them are made to just quaff and consume young. Is this a particular producer?
Yeah, this is a producer called Dunhoff. He's a very famous producer from a smaller region called the Naha. This is his basic wine. This is called an estate Riesling, so it's 100% estate-grown wine, all Riesling. It's basically from two different soil types. It's from slate and volcanic. When I'm tasting a wine, I'm thinking about a lot of different things. Aroma is obviously very important. Texture is really important. I think texture is probably important for spirit tasting as well. But that's really an aspect that I think it plays a huge role in tasting wine. And then I'm also thinking about kind of the arc of flavor. I'm thinking about harmony, like whether this wine is kind of completely knit, whether it all comes together, the pieces are kind of are interlocking. I think about wine in kind of a narrative arc. The beginning aromas building into this kind of core, what we would call like kind of the core of flavor, the center of the wine, that kind of, in this case, a very juicy, plush fruit flavor, and then kind of tapering into the finish and into this kind of more, I would say, mineral, salty, saline kind of ending. So there's a small amount of residual sugar in this wine, which I think is also an interesting aspect. It adds viscosity. It's not in the same way that alcohol does, but it has you can draw some correlations there.
How many grams per liter?
Is just over 25.
25 grams. So put that into context. Dry vermouth is like right around 50 grams per liter. Some of those awkward vermouths that are really like made to drink and not so easy to mix with tend to be like closer to 100. Biancos and Rossos and like classic sweet vermouths that we know, 180, 190, 200 grams of sugar per liter. Liqueurs are 400, 500 grams per liter. So just to put that into context for you. And then German wines I love. I have like a real love for it. And I fell in love, I think, working at Skurnik Wines because they are able to balance both sugar and acid in a way that few other places in the world are able to.
Are there technical definitions for what is dry versus off-dry?
In Germany there is, and it's kind of by country. So in Germany there's a legal designation called Trocken, and Trocken means dry, and that's below 9 grams of residual sugar, but within 2 grams of acidity. Acidity in German wine is measured by total acidity, and this wine is rather high in total acidity, but it also has a good amount of residual sugar, so the wine tastes balanced. This producer ages, he presses the wines, ferments them in either stainless steel or oak. The oak that he uses is completely neutral. And then every single one of his wines, whether it's a top, what they call Grosses Gewächs or Grand Cru site, or a basic wine like this, we'll see some aging in both stainless steel and oak. The oak is used, and it's not, it doesn't really impart an oak flavor. It gives a micro-oxidation to the wine.
There's Donhoff, particularly Cornelius Donhoff's wines. They taste like Cornelius Donhoff's wines. I mean, that comes through repetition of tasting. The only way to really learn and to get good at this exercise is just to be tasting constantly. But I remember the first time I had like one of my like transcending experiences with wine was with you at Craft Bar when what's his face was over there, and we drank a bottle of Cornelius's this vineyard that sits down underneath a bridge. It's called Brücke, means bridge. It sits super low, and it was the first time I ever tasted wine truly in color. Like it was like a synesthesia type of moment where like the wine was outright kaleidoscopic, and I like took a sip, closed my eyes, and saw fireworks. And it's something that I taste in his wines often, and it's something that I'm able to recall. So much of what this game is, this exercise, is recalling what it is, and color color is something we're going to talk about more as we move into spirits. You know, and with wine, it's like when I taste the color blue or the color purple, I often like go towards Grenache. It's like a juicy, jammy grape where some other grapes maybe don't have that type of thing.
Adam's a very special guy. Not everybody tastes like in color this synesthesia that he's talking about, but it's absolutely important to build a kind of a library in your mind of flavor. That's really what we're talking about here. Is like, and I think that's true of spirits. It's true of wine. It's true of food. You know, it's like, you know, when you're cooking, building a library of what things taste like and what flavors go together is really, really important, I think, especially for building cocktails as well. Cornelius would say that when he's tasting these wines, there's no analytics. So he never looks at, you know, a lab test of what the wine looks like in terms of total acidity and residual sugar and says, oh, the fermentation is done, it's time to stop. We're going to cool it down and put a little sulfur in it to stop the fermentation. Everything at that winery is done entirely by taste. He uses the same tasting glass that his father used. It's just purely finding balance, and that's really what I think for most of us what wine is about. I think that's what spirit is about too. It's finding the balance between all of these elements. I often think about wine tasting as kind of like this box where you have kind of lines pulling at different corners. You have acidity and sugar. You have kind of fruit flavor and minerality, and these kind of things, when they're in perfect tension, produce something that's really you know, the sum is much greater than the parts, and it's you know, when you find a wine that, as Adam was describing with this Brooker Riesling, or this wine here, which is a little more basic, but is in perfect balance and harmony.
Yeah, and I find, I mean, when we taste and we talk about spirits, I find like mezcal is a great example. Mezcal like often tastes in color. And I find a lot of similarities between Riesling. And I find a lot of Riesling drinkers really, really enjoy mezcal. There's a lot of overlap in that Venn diagram.
Yeah, it's about transparency. I think fruit distillates are another entire aspect, but yeah, I don't know what the blind spirits are.
We'll get there in a second.
Yeah.
Does anyone have any questions for Gabe before he goes and does the rest of his?
Sorry, just another one. How is acidity controlled? I mean, I assume residual sugar, the sugar is existing in the juice of the grapes, right? And the yeast is eating that and turning it in. So
is
if you
this,
stop that process, there's a certain amount of residual sugar, right?
Uh-huh.
What about acid?
So acid goes lower through fermentation. You lose acidity. So all of the acidity in this wine and top German wines is naturally occurring. So there's not acidity added. It's permitted to be added in certain ripe vintages where the acidity is low, but good producers won't do that, I would say. You're trying to do as little as possible in the cellar. What you're trying to do is get the most perfect fruit you possibly can. Cornelius' father, Helmut, says, you know, when you're holding the grapes in your hand, you have 100% of the possible quality. When you transfer it to the cellar, all you're doing is losing. You're losing flavor, you're losing aroma. So the idea for the winemaker is to capture as much of that as possible. So there are certain things that you can do to naturally lower the levels of acidity. One thing is skin contact. During skin contact, potassium will bind with acid and it'll precipitate out. So you can lose between 1 to 1.5, in some cases 2 grams with skin contact. And then through fermentation, you're losing acidity, and especially tartaric acid is precipitating out in the wine. But there's not really a way to increase the acidity. Basically, you're starting with fruit that has a certain amount of acidity, and really a lot of that knowledge and understanding is passed through generations and is something that is inherently known by producers, and good producers are tasting not just the wines that they're producing all the time, but also grapes. I was with Cornelius in late August, and we were walking through every one of his vineyards, tasting grapes, seeing that even in that kind of embryonic state, that there's still a difference between one vineyard and another. Some vineyards had higher acidity, some had lower. You know, and kind of drawing those conclusions. That's you know, a big part of winemaking is understanding what you're producing and kind of looking through a periscope, seeing what it's like today, what the grapes are like today, and imagining what they're going to be like when the wine is finished.
Which I imagine is getting increasingly more difficult to maintain some of this acidity and some of this balance as the world continues to die around us. And you know, I mean, not to take it to a real negative place, but I mean, in places like Germany, places like like Alsace is a great example. You know, I remember some of the first time I ever tasted Riesling ever was in the early 2000s, and it was like from like Marcel Dice coming out of Alsace. And when you taste the wines now, and granted, great winemakers produce great wine, and they tweak as they go in the vineyards and in the cellars, I suppose. But it's got to be difficult to like strike balance as the climate changes.
Yeah, there's a lot of different things that people are doing. I mean, one thing for winemakers, they're talking about, you know, the answer to climate change is soil health. So there are producers who are talking about biodynamics as like one answer to climate change. As you're getting higher levels of physiological or phenolic ripeness in grapes without high levels of sugar ripeness. So, you know, you can still produce delicate, elegant wines with, you know, 12, 12.5, or 11.5% alcohol, with full flavor. I mean, when I'm looking at wine, for me, what's really important is harmony and full flavor without huge texture or alcohol or intensity. I'm not interested in how intense or how big or how, you know, blockbustery a wine is. I want it to be harmonious, pretty, and elegant. Yeah.
Good?
Yeah.
Do the thing. All right, man.
All good.
Yeah.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Gabe. Amanda, you're in charge. I'm just going to sit here and back you up.
So obviously the majority of this seminar is really about the opportunity for sort of like a practical exercise in blind tasting, which I feel like many of us don't often have the chance to do, especially in the craziness of a regular workday. You have in front of you a list of bullet points for sort of ideal tasting scenarios, which of course is rarely ever the case, especially when we're working. Environment, aroma, just distractions in general, knowing what it is that we're tasting because we're not doing blind tasting, all of these things start to inform how we feel about a particular spirit when we're tasting. A lot of the stuff on this sheet isn't going to be a surprise, and there's certainly more we could have added, but I do find it surprising still that so many professionals in our industry never really got walked through the proper ways to taste and to do it to its utmost. I think, you know, we all enter the hospitality industry from different avenues, and so, you know, actually being able to sit down and have an organized assessment of like how we approach spirits for very few people ever really rarely happens, and you're either lucky enough to sort of take it upon yourself to learn or have someone teach you, or maybe you're still just sort of flying by the seat of your pants. So a lot of this stuff is just like reminders of best practices. Obviously, sort of keeping strong aromas out of the way is ideal. Certainly, one of the jobs when I first started, one of the first rules that we got was wearing no strong perfume, like while we were waiting tables, because we didn't want to affect people's tasting of the cocktails. That was the first time that had ever even occurred to me. No one had ever even mentioned that to me before. Things like drinking coffee, you know, which, you know, the number of times that I've walked into a tasting just having finished a coffee, because this is the same as like 9 in the morning for most of us right now. You know, it's the beginning of the day when you're going to events like this. Often we have people come into the bar to taste, or we even offer espresso a lot of the time.
We do, but you know, we were just talking about, and now we're saving it for now.
Yeah.
You know, people who do things consistently. So if that means you're a coffee drinker or a cigarette smoker or whatever the thing is that you do, there's something to be said for consistency. I remember talking to, at the time, the gardener from Yamazaki, from Suntory, and he was talking about how the master distiller of Suntory, you know, has the exact same breakfast every single morning, prepared the exact same way at the same time. So there's consistency in what he does. So I think as long as you're consistent, you know, people would argue some of this stuff.
Yeah, certainly it's a personal construct. And as long as you know how you're comparing things in a set, sort of like internal set of standards, I think that is the most important thing. On the back of this page, we've listed a number of sort of tasting prompters, just really meant as inspiration as we start going through these spirits. Certainly this is not an all-inclusive list, and we really encourage everyone to like dig deep for more specific descriptors as we go on. But this is culled from a number of spirits and wine resources, so you're going to get some mixes of descriptors in here that sort of apply to both, or maybe just one or the other. But just aspects to keep in mind if you're sort of looking for a push in your own brain as you're tasting through things.
I think it's important not to overthink also super important. Some of the best tasters, and one of the best tasters in this company is one of our graphic designers, who is not like classically trained in wine or spirits, who just surrounds himself with people, writes a lot of like tasting notes for like shelf talkers that go on the shelf, and through tasting and not overthinking, he has become maybe the best taster in this entire office, where we taste every single day with like wines for professionals. So just keep that in mind, that your gut is often right.
Yes. And to that note, we've poured everything that you have in front of you today is from our portfolio. Not to give any hints or anything, but so we haven't purposely put something in front of you that we feel is not of great quality. But certainly when we're sort of out in the field, so to speak, tasting so many different types of spirits that are being sort of sold from a number of different people with a number of different intentions in mind, that not all spirits are created equal. And it is important to really think about how you feel about what's in the glass, to not feel like you have to be polite if you feel that something isn't sort of structurally as you wish it were, if it's not right for your palate, if you feel that there's something about the character of a spirit that isn't up to snuff. Like this is tremendously important to us every day as we're assessing what to put on our shelves or on our back bars. So even though we're not sort of digging deep into anything that's sort of like subpar today, always keep that in mind as well. Not all spirits are delicious. That having been said, we should start tasting. You have a sheet in front of you of tasting criteria. It's the same for each spirit, so we're just going to go through. Essentially what we're going to do is give you about 5 minutes per flight to taste silently and sort of write down your own notes. These prompts in your tasting criteria are really meant to help draw you towards some more specific conclusions about what might be in the glass. If there's something that you don't have an answer for, that's okay too. But sort of anything you write down is helpful. So even if you can't think of something specific, if you don't think you know exactly what the proof is or what the category of spirit is, write down what it reminds you of, anything that's going to start to help you get to a spot. And then when we're done with the flight, we'll reveal what we actually
Right, so we'll do flight one, just the two spirits side by side. We'll do the reveal, and we want to talk about it. Any questions you have specifically about the spirits, like we'll give you the bullet points up front, but more questions that you might have, maybe uses. Some of us maybe come from like culinary backgrounds or work in restaurants and are deeply involved in foods. There's so many. I remember like I got into like bartending because someone in 2007 took me to Death & Co. and I was like, oh, this is exactly the same thing as cooking. I know how to cook. I probably could learn how to bartend. There's so much overlap between these things, and I think thinking kind of critically like this allows you to better pair things, whether it's in cocktails or someone's grabbing a bottle off a shelf. These are the ways we need to be thinking, right? So maybe you start tasting right now, and as you taste, at least for this first one, we're going to talk out loud and sort of prompt you. You don't need to be watching us. Just put your head down, start analyzing number 1 and 2 in flight 1, and just hear our voice. And we're not going to do this every time, but we'll do it for this first round. Ready, set, go.
So proof often ends up being a really easy place to start when you're figuring out what you're drinking. Obviously, things like liqueurs are going to be lower in proof. A lot of bourbons, a lot of mezcals are going to be higher. I tend to find that sort of below 45 and above 45 sweet spot is a really great place to start because you have an instinct in your own palate about what that is based on all the things that you've tasted. For me, mezcal has always been a pretty strong part of my life, so 45 especially ends up being a nice dialed-in proof to start comparing things to. And then we can start moving from there.
Yeah, and we also know that, things that are wine-based, like vermouth, are obviously lower, and liqueurs tend to be lower in alcohol. Aperitivi are lower in alcohol than 40%. Vodka is a nice benchmark. I mean, I know I first got drunk on vodka when I was like 12, and it was 40%. But the difference between 40% and 50%, if you guys maybe sell or work with Rittenhouse, that's a very different thing. And then we look at the color: is it aged or is it unaged? If this is unaged, we know that this probably isn't going to be a bourbon unless it's a White Dog or something like that. So we can learn a lot just through the color itself.
Aromatics are going to give a lot of good sense about what it may be made from as well, definitely as much as what you taste on the palate. And if you can start to break down between fruit and grain, that's going to put
And
you
cane.
and cane. that's going to put you in some very specific areas as well.
And then let's get specific. I mean, fruit is a very broad category. You know, agave is a type of fruit. So are grapes. You know, and once you start to, and so is apples and pears. Is this an eau de vie? You know, eau de vie being something, type of brandy that is distilled from fruit and unaged. You know, as you taste, you know, you're going to taste some of these fruity or grainy qualities or caney qualities, and often there's overlap between those flavors as well.
Level of sweetness can be a really important thing to start to gauge because, of course, some spirits will have sugar added, others won't. Even once you get into fruit, you know, there are certainly eau de vies that have been produced dry. There are rums that are very rich in sort of their residual sugar, or sugar has been added. So this can start to break down the categories that you're thinking of as well.
Yeah, I mean, so right, that richness can come from sugar added, or, you know, right, concentration of flavor due to lengthy aging. But if it's clear, there probably isn't aging that's going on. Fruit has acidity. Is this acidic? When we talk about acidity in wine, you know, it translates into, oh, I have saliva underneath my mouth that's forming right now, versus, you know, maybe tannins that dry the sides of your mouth out. Tannins coming from the skins themselves of a fruit, or the wood that it's been aged in, or the stems, or whatever it may be. So acidity, when it comes to spirits, translates into both saliva under your tongue, also a fineness on the tongue, and a length of spirit. You know, when something is lacking acidity, it might taper off very quickly, where when it's high in acidity, the finish goes on forever. It's why something from Grand Champagne and cognac costs more money. It takes longer. It also slows the aging process down when you're talking about acidity, right?
Well, we put musical pitch and color feel down here as well, which is
'Cause I
something we
insist.
started to get into earlier. I mean, even though Gabe said you are special, which I do think is true, I do find that there are a lot of people in this industry that talk about spirits and color, and especially about cocktails and sort of like color feels and palettes as well.
And for me, the reason I think it's so important is because very often we're dealing, you know, our next seminar is about spirits that are a little bit more complicated to talk about, a little bit lesser known. And a lot of people who sit down at our bars and our restaurants and come into our retail shops, you know, they say, you know, is it good? Is it good? They don't mean, is it good? Of course it's good. We put it on our menu, we put it on our shelf. We know it's good. We don't know what this thing is. And the common denominator, if you could break it down to something totally basic that everyone understands, no one feels stupid in the process. And this is all about making people feel comfortable. This is the hospitality industry. This is the service industry. And there's nothing worse than when someone starts speaking a language you don't understand, you know? So it's super important.
Yeah. So musical pitch, you know, speaks to that same thing, which for some people is a more instinctive way to talk about it than color. But both sort of same idea. Is this a high-toned, a low-toned? Is this, you know, bright greens and yellows, or is it sort of base, like amber, like fall colors? And maybe once you start getting into aged spirits, there's a nice correlation there for people.
I know when I taste cognac and we talk about things being young and in their primary phase, their green phase, right? Green, just like maybe a person is new at a job and they're green, right? You know, those flavors are green apple and green pear and mineral, and they're light and they're lean and they're thin and they're not heavy and viscous. You know, length, it could be long because of its quality, but maybe not. You know, and then as that thing ages, maybe if we're talking something like cognac or whatever, you know, maybe green turns into yellow or red, and maybe that white peach is now a peach dripping down your face. These are different things. These sing in different tones. These appear in different colors.
We've left room for you to put descriptors down for what you're sensing on the aroma, the mid-palate, and the finish. I think especially when it comes to spirits, you know, there can be such a wide flavor arc between that beginning and that end point. Not everyone swallows when they taste spirits, which is perfectly fine, but like you definitely do get a different quality on the finish of a spirit than you do on the mid-palate often, or maybe you don't, in which case, if this is a spirit that's sort of lingering in the same spot the whole way through, that can start to tell you a lot about its structure as well. So try to push yourself to put down at least a couple adjectives for each of those sections, especially before we start talking out loud and start influencing each other's opinions about stuff, which is, you know, flavor can be very susceptible in that way. To that point, flavors and foods, what would you pair this with? We thought this would be important to put down as well because, you know, once we reveal what these spirits are, they may be things that you've sort of pigeonholed in your own brain about what they're appropriate to either mix with or pair with food. But maybe as it stands right now, when you don't know what it is and you're just, judging purely on flavor, you're going to come up with associations that wouldn't have occurred to you if we just told you outright what you had in glass. So take a couple seconds to think about that as well.